Hello friends, in the series which we are doing in issues in world history 20th century, we will talk about industrialization. Today in the earlier lecture on industrialization, we talked about that how we have to see industrialization in the framework of the capitalist developments which were taking place in the 18th and 19th century, and how this has also been in a way seen in the framework of the industrial revolution as well, which took place in Britain, and how the development of the industries in different parts of Europe, especially beginning from Britain, they were also being talked about. And when we talk about these kinds of developments, we find that how thinkers, they have also tried to see them in their own way. And we talked about Marx in the earlier lecture, and we also talked about Theodor Hamerow, that how he has tried to see the industrialization during this time, and how scholars like Maxine Berg, they have questioned some of the assumptions of these perspectives by pointing out that they reinforce old technological determinism of the most accounts of the industrial revolution. And by technological determinism, we mean that how technology is one of the most determining factors in that sense, and how the kind of changes which took place in the industrial revolution, we find that technology definitely is seen to be one of the most important factors. And when you talk about Berg, we find that he has also talked about the Landis approach, that how the approach of David Landis, it traced the history of the most progressive industries without inquiring into patterns by which they were adapted within different regions in Europe. So some kind of a generalization which was being done by David Landis in that sense, where we find that he looked into the most progressive industries, and the different regions of Europe, they were not taken into account in that sense. Regional industries, they were not being conducted. Some kind of generalizations, they were being made by him, and he also did not explore why mechanization occurred faster in that sense and earlier in her industrial history in USA than in England. So we find that this kind of mechanization which happened faster in USA was not being looked into, and why French industry found it difficult to adapt to British power and coal using techniques, that the kind of changes which came in Britain, how they were not being adapted in France, they were also not looked into by David Landis. And we see that how over a period of time industrialization is used as a synonym for sustained economic growth, and it is said to occur in a given country when output and the real incomes per head, they begin to rise steadily and without any apparent limit. And we see that this kind of an expansion of the total output alone, however, is not a sufficient criteria of industrializations, since if population is rising more rapidly than output, it is compatible with declining real incomes per head. So not only production and productivity, but at the same time the population has to be taken into account, because if population is increasing more than the output, then it will eat away whatever increase in the production has happened. Then one can also talk about the abundance of capital in land, and which might give rise for a time to growing real incomes per head, and how we find that the abundance of capital and land it also produces a growth in the economy which can be described as industrialization if the material technology remains unchanged. So we see that these kinds of ideas, they are being talked about, and it is one of the important aspects of the industrial process as well. And we see, when you talk about different countries, and a country which retains a large, even a predominant agricultural sector may be described as industrialized if real incomes rise and technology changes. And when you talk about industrialization, how associated with this idea are a number of economic and social changes that follow directly from its defining characteristics. So we just cannot reduce industrialization only to the machinery or the mechanical activity which is happening, but we find that how the social and economic factors, or they are also very very important. And when you talk about these kinds of ideas, then we find that when these kinds of changes which are happening in the framework of only income and technology, then we find that the economic and social changes, they are also very relevant in that context. And when we talk about industrial revolution in Britain, we find that this was also being talked about, that how the entrepreneurship of the people definitely played an important role, whereas there is also room for the argument about the length and the makeup of the any list of the concomitants of the industrialization. There is near unanimity upon the central identifying characteristics, which is the rise in the real income per head. So when one is talking about these aspects, one of the most important thing when we talk about industrialization is the industrial revolution. And probably no term from the economic historians lexicon has been more widely accepted than the industrial revolution. And this is also unfortunate from the point of view that the term itself has no scientific standing, and it conveys a grossly misleading impression of the nature of the economic change. So when you talk about industrial revolution and how the idea of industrial revolution, it has also been criticized as well, we find that the term itself is open to scrutiny, in that sense that whether this kind of an economic change which took place in Europe at that point of time is to be referred to as industrial revolution. So there is some kind of divergence of opinion among scholars regarding this, and we find that for more than a century it has been used to denote that period in the British history that witnessed application of mechanically powered machinery in the textile industries, and the introduction of James Watt's steam engine, and the triumph of the factory system of production. And by analogy, we find that the term has been applied to the onset of the industrialization in other countries, although without general agreement on dates in that sense. And we see that when you talk about industrial revolution, this kind of an expression industrielle was first used in 1820s by the French writers, who, wishing to emphasize the importance of the mechanization of the French cotton industry then taking place in Normandy and Nord, compared it with the great political revolution of 1789. So we find that this kind of terminology, it was being used in 1820s by the French writers at that point of time, and they were talking in the framework of the mechanization of the French cotton industry, and how this industry or its development was being compared with the political revolution of 1789. So we find that such an expression was in the framework of the great change which came during this time, and it was being seen in that particular framework. So this idea of revolution which was being applied to an economic aspect was also very real in that sense, and we also see that how when it was being compared to the political revolution, because that great political revolution brought about major changes during this time. And we also see in 1837 Jerome Adolphe Blanqui referred to La Revolution Industrielle in England, and contrary to the widespread belief, Karl Marx did not use the term in its conventional sense as well, and we find that it gained currency only after the publication in 1884 of the Arnold Toynbee's lectures on industrial revolution in England, popular addresses, notes and other fragments, and Toynbee dated British industrial revolution from 1760. And the date is implicit in Toynbee's lectures. 1760 to 1822 were arbitrarily determined by the reign of George III, on which Toynbee had been invited to lecture. So we find that this idea of industrial revolution, especially it gained currency because of the writings of Arnold Toynbee, and his ideas they were being in a way talked about, and how this kind of development was being given in his lectures, and we find this idea was unchallenged for nearly 50 years until Professor J.U. Neff stressed on the essential continuity of history and traced its beginnings to 1540 to 1660 with new capitalistic industries of Elizabethan England. And so we find that before this also some kind of capitalistic developments in the framework of industrialization, they were being traced from the earlier history. As you can see on the screen as well, that when you talk about the early descriptions of the phenomena and how they emphasize the great inventions and the dramatic nature of changes which came about, and as an 1896 textbook put it, change was sudden and violent. So great innovations, they were all being made in a very short space of time, and a description that A.P. Usher dryly characterized as exhibiting all high forms of historical inaccuracy. So we find that when you talk about these kinds of changes which were being seen as sudden and violent in that sense, and because of which the idea of industrial revolution stuck, and how it was being used during this time by the scholars to talk about the kind of changes which came, and the early interpretations also emphasized what was assumed to be harmful consequences of the new mode of production. And we find that although the increases in productivity as a result of the use of mechanical power and machinery, they were being acknowledged during this time, but we also find there was a lot of criticism as well in those accounts where we find the use of the child labor or the displacement of traditional skills by machinery and unwholesome conditions of new factory towns. And we find that this kind of an idea of industrial revolution had a very pejorative connotation during this time, that how industrial revolution was being questioned, how it was being criticized for its demerits within the framework of the usage of the child labor, or the kind of conditions which were very critical from the point of view of the workers, that how the workers, they were being treated and how they had to work for longer hours, and they were not being paid the way they should have been. So this kind of criticism could be seen during this time. And when you talk about the various kinds of ideas with regard to emergence of capitalism, then we see that how origins of capitalism are traced variously to the growth of the merchant capital and the external trade, or to the spread of monetary transactions within feudalism by commuting of feudal rent and services into money. And this kind of a debate, it talks about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and pertains mainly to the Western European experience where capitalism first emerged. And whatever reasons for its origins, period from about 15th to 18th century is generally accepted as merchant capital phase of capitalism, where we find that how the kind of trade which was happening and the colonization also was also being carried out by the state chartered monopolies played a pivotal role in this phase of capitalism in Holland, Spain, Portugal, England and France. So we find that how, because of the geographical explorations and how because of the various companies, for example the East India Company of Britain or the East India Company of various other European nations, and how these East Indian companies, they played an important role in the kind of trade which was happening between the East and West. And so this kind of a thrust which was being given because of these companies to the trade, and thereafter we see that how the colonies, they were being created when they were trading with these countries. And one of the shining examples of British colony was India, apart from so many other countries which were being colonized by Britain. And that is why this kind of an idea which is being given with regard to the British colonialism, that the sun never set on the British Empire, because we find that in so many countries where Britain ruled, and where we find that this kind of continued exploitation of these colonial resources took place. So, we find that this was a phase which is being referred to as mercantile capitalism, and which was largely based on trade. And thereafter we talk about the industrial phase of the capitalism, and where we find that how there was an upsurge in the power using machinery in the industrial revolution in Britain. And when you talk about theories for the emergence of capitalism, which have been advanced by the thinkers like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Franklin Mandel in the theory of proto-industrialization, and Emmanuel Wallerstein. So, when you talk about these thinkers, those who have talked about industrial revolution and the kind of changes which have come over a period of time in the economy, Adam Smith, for example, in the model put forward by Adam Smith, as you can see on the screen as well, and he wrote a text called An Inquiry into Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And in that particular book he talks about the development of a society's wealth, and how he equated with the development of the productivity of labor is a function of the degree of division of labor. So, Adam Smith was also popular because of the idea of the laissez-faire or the free trade, which he talked about. And we find that how, when he was talking about a society's wealth, and how he equated it with the development of the productivity of labor, because labor would be the key determinant. And over a period of time we also see that how division of labor also played an important role, because in any kind of a capitalist development, division of labor is one of the most important aspects of that particular capitalist development. And Smith simply meant in this way the specialization of the productive tasks, in that manner that how we have to be very specialized in that sense. And it was classically achieved through the separation of the agriculture and manufacturing and their assignment to country and town respectively. And in this sense we find that how there was some kind of a separation in agriculture and industry, and how the rural areas and the urban areas, they had to cater to the different needs. And this kind of a division of labor in industrial production, it was made possible an unprecedented growth in the output and the productivity. And if it was possible to sell this enhanced output over a wide market, then such division would prove profitable as well. And these kinds of profits could be plowed back into the further profitable activity. So, we find that when this kind of surplus which has been created because of more production, more productivity, and then that surplus is being in a way put into the economy back in the framework of, so it will create some kind of a profitable activity, and it will also lead to some kind of a capital formation. And this capital formation would be very important to the industry in that sense. And when you talk about Smith, the degree of specialization is bound up with the degree of the development of trade as well, he says, and the degree to which a potentially interdependent specialized labor force can be, and is linked up via commercial nexuses. So, we find that Smith was also very particular with regard to talking about these kinds of aspect, that how when you are talking about specialization, it was also bound up with the development of trade as well, and how he also talks about a potentially interdependent specialized labor force in that sense. And also it was how it was linked up via the commercial nexuses as well. So, one of the important aspects of Smith's principle was in the framework of the division of labor, and how it was limited by the extent of the market, literally the size of the area and the population linked up via trade relations. So, we find that for Smith, the development of trade and the division of labor unfailingly brought about economic development as well. And the kind of argument which he has given, that the separation of manufacture and agriculture and their allocation to the town and country, consequently upon the development of trading connections, will lead to a process of economic growth, and because of which we find that the increased productivity will be there, which naturally follows from the producer's concentration on the single line of production rather than a multiplicity of different ones, and it has a certain plausibility as well. So, when you talk about Smith's argument, we say that how when he separates manufacturing as well as agriculture, and how both the areas they need to be in a way allocated to the town and the country, and how trading connections would follow, and economic growth was in a way linked to it, and we find that how the producers they are concentrating on a single line of production rather than the multiplicity, and it has some kind of a plausibility in that sense. And when you talk about these kinds of aspects in a general framework, we find that these kinds of ideas which have been talked about by Smith, they can be understood largely within the framework of the British economy as well, and largely when he tries to apply them in the framework of the European economy, then they also have some kind of a relevance. And we also see that how the growth of wealth in the interaction between the division of labor and the growth of markets, we find that Smith liberated economics from an agrarian bias such as physiocrats had imparted to it, or narrow commercial bias that mercantilists had given it. So, in that sense, physiocrats of France, how they in a way talked about that kind of an economics which had that kind of an agrarian bias, which from which Smith liberated it, or in that sense the narrow commercial bias which was being given by the mercantilists, that was also being removed by Smith. And when you talk about Smith, he says that surplus did not originate in the land alone, nor was the acquisition of the treasure and the precious metals any longer the sole or the desirable measure of economic prosperity. So, he talked about these kinds of ideas, he talked about the laissez-faire, the free trade, he talked about, and we see that the wealth could not take the form of the marketable commodities. If wealth holders then spent it productively in further investment, wealth would grow. So, in that sense we find that capitalist or this capital formation was an important idea during this time, and how when you are creating that wealth and again investing that wealth in the further creation of wealth, that was an important component of his ideas. And we also see that the growth of commerce and the growth of liberty, they were mutually determine each other for Smith and his fellow political economists. He traced the advance of capitalism to the onset of conditions that liberated purportedly inherent human qualities, and to the beneficent operations in market transactions of an invisible hand that brought the common good out of the conflicting self-interest of all individuals. So, we find that Smith and others, those who were thinking on the similar lines, and how they trace the advance of capitalism to the kind of things which were happening in the framework of the conditions, and how the human qualities they were also linked in that sense, and the market transactions they were also being talked about. And so all these kinds of aspects they were relevant from the point of view of how Smith talked about or thought in that particular framework. And definitely commerce could be seen as a key to prosperity, but only its unhindered pursuit would secure the maximum prosperity. This is what he talks about. And commerce, by spreading worldwide and making accumulation of wealth possible in liquid, that is transportable form, renders the merchants independent of political tyranny, and hence increases chances of growth of liberty. So, how it was also linked to the question of liberty, that if one will have more wealth in that sense, then there would be less tyranny in the chances of the growth of liberty as well. And the other thinkers apart from Smith, those who have talked about capitalism, and Marx is another one who talks about the transition from the feudalism to capitalism, and it was never a major preoccupation for Marx when we try to understand him and Engels as well. And but also we see that it was nonetheless a problem addressed periodically in the discussions of more central themes such as historical materialist method, the capitalist mode of production, or the class conflict in history. So Marx largely deals with these kinds of aspects, and we have talked about that how it was not a major preoccupation for Marx in that sense, or for that matter Engels, that they talked about from feudalism to capitalism. But the kind of themes on which they talk about, they were directly or indirectly related to these kinds of aspects, and many of the things which have been ascribed to Marx, many times Marx did not talk about them. But other Marxist thinkers, they gave some kind of a thought to it. They derived ideas from the beliefs of Marx, and Marx talks about capitalism as a powerful and dynamic and a superior form of production that promoted the economic growth far above anything possible in feudalism. And he attributed its appearance not to the release of the natural unchanging human predispositions, but to the specific economic, political and legal measures. And when one talks about his interpretation of the emergence of capitalism, two broad perspectives are offered. His first emphasizes corrosive effect upon feudal system of mercantile activity, the growth of a world market and a new expanding cities. And when he talks about the mercantile capitalism within an autonomous urban sphere, provides initial dynamics towards capitalism, and how the merchants they entered the production and employed wage laborers. And the second variant is the evident especially in the capital, when it centers on the producer and the process whereby the producer, agriculture or in the craft sector, he becomes merchant and the capitalist. And Marx also regards latter as really revolutionary path to capitalism, since this transforms organization and techniques of production. So we find that Marx also had his own ideas with regard to the capital and the industry during that time, and he was very well aware about the kind of developments which were happening in the European society at that point of time. So we will continue talking about Marx and his ideas with regard to industrialization in our next lecture. Thank you very much.